Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream tonight. It is June 27th, Wednesday, 2018. Tonight we're going to be talking about whether a gold standard makes any sense today. But first, before we get started, let's take a look at what happened during the day. The big Supreme Court case decided today involving unions. The Supreme Court decided in a 5-4 decision that unions could not require people who are not in the union to pay union dues. Now, there are some states where that was the law. The Supreme Court struck that down as unconstitutional, violative of the First Amendment. And one of the complaints has been with unions, especially from the rank and file, not everyone in the rank and file is either all Democrat or all Republican or for one social issue or against the other, except the union leadership often veers in one direction, and that direction is normally left. And they tend to get, and they say that this is going to have a significant impact on the Democratic Party, not just on the unions and their dues, of about $5 billion of fees they won't collect. And that money generally ends up getting circulated to causes, and then eventually some of those causes donated to the Democratic Party, and it could cut off significant amounts of funding. I've always had an issue with it just from the point of view, whether it went to Republicans or Democrats is not my concern. It's just that you're forcing somebody to pay for something that they're not necessarily agreeing to. Now, you can argue they get the benefit of the union contract even if they're not in the union, but the idea is they've made a choice not to be in the union. I would have thought they would have decided the case based on a property right, because I would view that as a taking without due process of your cash. However, they decided it on First Amendment grounds. And again, it was a 5-4 decision. The reason that's important is Justice Kennedy announced today that he will be resigning, I think, at the end of July. And he is what you call a swing judge. There's 9 Supreme Court justices. Generally sides with the conservative majority when there's a 5-4 decision, but he has at times, about 25 times in his career, been the swing vote on some very key important liberal issues like same-sex marriage and a few others. So the left wing or the Democrats appreciate that you can count on Justice Kennedy sometimes to tip the balance. The concern about now is that Donald Trump will get another Supreme Court justice, and he'll pick somebody who probably isn't going to occasionally swing left. He will probably pick somebody who will always swing right. However, you never know with judges. I know that Eisenhower appointed 2 of the most liberal judges ever, Earl Warren, I forgot the name of the other guy, and they asked Eisenhower what his biggest mistakes were as president. And he says they're both sitting on the Supreme Court. So you never know what's going to happen. But in any event, Trump is going to get another Supreme Court justice, and it's probably only a matter of time until Justice Ginsburg throws in the towel. She also is one of the 4 liberal judges, and if that were to be the case, and Trump were to get a Kennedy replacement who would be a more solid conservative, that would make him 5, and then you'd have 4 left, and then if Ginsburg left and you got another, that would be 6-3, and it would be Sotomayor and Kagan holding up the left wing there. All right, let's take a look at the gold and silver prices during the day. They fell. Gold fell a bit to $12.52. Silver actually dipped below $16 for the first time in a long time. I think it got as low as about $15.95. The markets have reopened. It's about $16.07 right now, and gold is at $12.52. The crypto markets did a bit better again for the second day in a row. Litecoin is about $81. Bitcoin didn't move as much. It's about $6,130. Bcash $713, and Ethereum of about $442. Now let's get to the does a gold standard make sense? The reason I'm on this topic, I just did a live not a live stream, but an interview with Silver Fortune, and we were talking about the possibility of China or another country backing its currency with gold. And I explained, and we'll get into it in a second, why that's not a good idea, why that's not going to happen. But the original impetus for this discussion was Neil Kashkari, who is the Fed president of Minneapolis. He put out a tweet, and he obviously is a central planner. He believes in what they call intervention and monetary policy, and believes that central planners need to have the ability to go in and do what they need to do with the money supply. So he tweeted out, and basically all the people I know that read the tweet misinterpreted it the same way that I misinterpreted it. Let me read you what he wrote. Imagine we abolished the central bank and went back to a gold standard. Now, most people who are gold bugs think the gold standard is a great idea. I don't think it's a great idea, but not for the reasons you might think. And I think when I give you my reasons, you might realize you're not in favor of either. But Neil Kashkari is against it for a different reason, but all of us who read what he wrote thought he was against it for another reason. Okay, so let's try to parse through all that. So he said, imagine we abolished the central bank and went back to a gold standard. The money supply and hence inflation rate is then set by gold miners and how much gold they happen to dig up in a given year. That makes no sense. So he decided that it makes no sense to do a gold standard because of this reliance on gold miners. And what the people that I was watching follow this had the same reaction that I did, was that basically there's a lot of issues maybe with the gold standard, but the amount of gold that the miners happen to produce every year, it really doesn't add that much to the total stocks of gold. So that's not a problem. And a lot of people made the same point. They said, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. The amount of gold that's mined every year, maybe it adds 1%, 2%. There are all types of people putting up their estimates of how much gold is added to the gold supply every year. And that's not what he meant. But everyone I was following, and myself included, we were looking at this. So I did a poll, and I said, what's the problem with the gold standard? And the poll basically asked, is it trust in the administration of the gold standard? Is it because it's inflexible? Is it because there's reliance on miners? Or is there no problem with the gold standard? Well, given that my followers are basically the gold people, 61% said no problem with the gold standard. That's just like, that's the holy grail to them. Gold standard, they have gold. Gold standard's good. 29% said trust in administration. It's pretty much where I come out with. 8% said it's inflexible. And 2% said reliance on miners. Basically saying, see, Neil Kashkari, you're not making any sense because you don't understand the gold market. Actually, he does. And it took me a while to figure out what he was saying. I was thinking it through and I was saying, well, it's possible in a free market and you might have spikes in the mining supply in certain years, decreases, but they'd have to be so dramatic for there to be a significant positive or negative shock to the price of gold. And I still don't know what he was talking about. And then I read more people complaining about him. And I was thinking, wait, the miners, they wouldn't have any power because even if they wish to exercise it, they can't ramp up production 4 times overnight with no cost. Then I realized, as a central bank might be able to do with fiat money, then I started to understand what he was talking about. Existing gold stocks dwarf any annual production in recent years. Sure. But the thing about central bankers, he was thinking a different way. He was saying you'd be at the mercy of whatever the gold miners happen to mine. So even though annual gold mining production each year has a scant impact on the overall supply of money, supply of gold, and therefore money if you're on a gold standard, and then other than finding like massive amounts of new easily accessible gold, miners are going to be constrained. by their own economic and resources. They're not just going to print more gold, I mean, make more gold or produce more gold. So there wouldn't be much of an impact. And if they stop producing gold, that wouldn't be much of an impact either, because there's still all the other gold above ground. So still starting to wonder, what is he talking about? And then I realized that what he was concerned about is his ability as a central banker. Increases or decreases in the money supply per miners, as we just all pointed out to him, wouldn't be that much. They might add a little bit, they might not add any, but it would have nothing to do with the state of the economy. In other words, it wouldn't be, miners wouldn't necessarily be adding or subtracting for any benefit to the macro economy. It would just be based on their micro economy, what's happening in the gold market and what's happening to their cost, but not necessarily, it isn't going to impact overall monetary policy. So the reliance he was talking about was their inability to increase the gold and money supply when he would think it would be needed, or worse, they might stop production at inopportune times, meaning that they may want to boost the money supply as central planners, and the miners just didn't find it economical to even add any gold and then to stop mining altogether. So that was what his point was, that he viewed a gold standard as being he would have picked inflexible and then reliance on gold miners, because he couldn't increase the money supply if he wanted to, if it was a pure gold standard, because you couldn't count on the miners to increase it as much as you wish it could be. So he was precisely concerned that there may not be enough gold coming on market. He was worried that there would be an inability to make meaningful interventions in the money supply. So it's interesting, you see, if you think a fixed money supply is good, like most people who are in favor of sound money, you don't worry about the mining production adding much in a given year or not mining at all, because it wouldn't impact the stocks that much. But if you want to increase the money supply, like central banks do, then it's a major factor that they can control. That basically the money supply remains relatively fixed, subject to a little bit on the margins as to how much the miners might make. And it took me a long while to realize what his issue was. It isn't that there wouldn't be enough gold, as all the other gold people on the thread were thinking, but that increases in the money supply could not be effectuated by the Fed. That they would be at the mercy of new mining supply, which only adds small amounts to the overall supply on a percentage basis each year. At worst, what happens if mining declines or stops? That would be the effect of tightening, or maybe they didn't want to tighten it. They didn't think tightening was a good idea. So that is his issue with the gold miners controlling the money supply. He views that as a flaw. Not only do miners control the new money coming on market instead of the central bankers, but the miners' ability to inflate the money supply is also limited. So what they can actually add it to. So they could never do QE. They couldn't say, we need stimulus and we're going to add more money to the circulation. We're going to increase the money supply. They couldn't. Unless the miners, they'd have to make the miners mine more. And that's really outside of their purview. Now, this got me thinking, why is it underlying why people didn't understand what he was saying was that people were interested in the gold standard and they were interested in a tight money supply. That's the underlying assumption that we had why we didn't understand what he was talking about. But if you think this one through, a lot of gold people are in favor of the gold standard. We saw 60% said none. Like, gold standard is the best thing that can happen. But there's a number of issues with the gold standard that gold people should be aware of. First of all, there's two types of gold standards. There was the classical gold standard, where every country basically fixes their currency to a unit of gold, and they also have domestically, people can turn in their paper and get gold, and every country agrees on that, and they all work on that. And when you have a balance of trade surplus, you get gold, and when you have a deficit, you lose gold. And it works pretty well, and you really can't increase the money supply unless you have gold. And obviously, the richer you get, the more surplus you have, the more gold you can get. The Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 was a very odd hybrid gold standard. Let's go back to 1933. This is why a gold standard is not a good idea. In 1933, Roosevelt confiscated, nationalized the country's gold supply. So what he did in 1933, he ordered all the gold back to the U.S. Treasury, including all the coins that were then in circulation. So if you had a double eagle, an eagle, you had to turn it in, and they gave you the $20.67 that it was worth at the time. They took all that gold, they melted it down, they built Fort Knox, and by 1937, they moved the gold into Fort Knox. In 1934, Congress, by an act of Congress, fixed the price of gold up from $20.67 to $35 an ounce. In between the time that Congress acted and actually set the price of gold by statute, Franklin Roosevelt and I think it was his Treasury Secretary Morgenthau, they would set the price of gold themselves while Roosevelt was in his pajamas, and they would just make up numbers in between $20 and $30. The reason they were able to do that was because the United States basically had a good large amount of the world's gold. But they fixed the price of gold at $35. Now think about this. From 1934 to the end of 1974, until Gerald Ford reversed the illegality of American citizens holding gold, the price of gold was $35 an ounce. 1935 to 1974, which means during the Bretton Woods period from 1944 to August 8th or 15th, whenever Nixon took the U.S. off the Bretton Woods standard in 1971, gold not only was illegal to own, but it was $35 an ounce, and that doesn't make a stitch of sense. A lot of the issues they had with gold was that it was $35 an ounce, and the United States didn't want to devalue the dollar. But here's the problem with the Bretton Woods Agreement. And I don't know whether Neil Kashkari was talking about a classical gold standard. I think not. I think he was talking about the Bretton Woods standard, because he wouldn't be able to decide on a international classical gold standard. You'd have to get all the countries to agree, to all of them, to back their currencies by units of gold. Right now, every country has agreed, basically, to be on a fiat currency system. They're all on a fiat currency system where none of them back their currencies by gold. So the idea that any of them would want to return to a classical gold standard where they all have to return to gold, that's almost an impossibility. The way the IMF thinks is you all hold assets as central banks, and those assets are going to be other countries' debt, SDRs, other countries' currencies, which are unbacked, and if you have some gold. So for the most part, all countries have agreed that unbacked fiat currencies and debt instruments of fiat currencies are assets. They've all agreed on that. So they're all involved in unison that this, what you might call debt Ponzi scheme, is the way to go. They've all agreed to it. So the only way you can actually change it into a gold standard would have to be something where you already have a dominant currency like the United States, world reserve currency, and then you switch it back over to a gold standard. Now, if you were to go over to a gold standard at this point, you hit a couple of issues. First of all, you'd have to fix the price of gold. Well, when they had the price fixed of gold in 1944, remember, Americans couldn't own it, and basically much of the rest of the world didn't own it. The United States had most of it. If you were to go to a gold standard today, it'd be very hard to control the price of gold, because you'd have to have, even during the Bretton Woods period, if you read the CIA documents, there used to be a free market price, and then they would struggle amongst the central banks at the London Gold Pool to try to keep the price of gold at $35. Well, today, It'd be much harder because of all the gold that's in India, China, it's all over the world. It'd be very hard for the United States, first of all, to convince every other country that they're going to be on a gold standard, and the price would have to be fixed. They wouldn't agree to it. The other problem is individual ownership would either be outlawed, or if it wasn't outlawed, there'd be no point in holding it. And therefore, you couldn't, quote, protect yourself against what the government did. So if the government mismanaged everything, it wouldn't matter. Your price of gold would still be whatever they fixed the price at. The reason I'm against it is you don't want the governments to control the gold. You want there to be some safety net or outlet where even though if the gold is manipulated, the price of gold, there's a chance that it actually will protect you against the fiat imbalances or collapses in the financial system. But if they fix the price of gold at a certain price, you're done. That's the price. And probably they would probably want to confiscate it because it'd be easier for them to control the price if there wasn't a lot of gold floating around. See, that's why they collected all that gold and they were able to reprice it at $35, giving themselves a nice tidy profit and devaluing the dollar at the same time. So they confiscated the gold at $20.67 in April 1933, and then by early 1934 they repriced it at $35. So I don't think you want the price of gold to be fixed by the government and the gold perhaps essentially be owned only by the government. Now, let's get to some of the points, because the gold standard is very often defended, and I defend the concept that you don't want central banks deflating your currency. You don't want central banks or fiscal policy, remember we talked about this the other night, to be reckless and spend money it doesn't have. On a fiat-based, debt-based system, they can always expand the money supply. The central banks are happy. They've got the tools they need. The politicians are happy because they can spend money they don't have. All they have to do is issue debt. And if you're in a fiat system, if all the other central banks and other countries of the world are on a fiat system, they actually value sovereign debt of other fiat-based countries that issue fiat currencies. So it's really good for all of them. It's not good for the people because it steals the value of their wealth, but it's very good for the central banks and the politicians who want to promise stuff because there's no restriction on you. So that's the best part of a gold standard. However, during a gold standard, you don't have a safety net yourself. You're relying on the government to uphold the gold standard and to do the right thing and to be a smart steward. You're not going to receive any value for your gold because they'll fix the price and it'll be worse than it is today. You think they manipulate now? They'll openly and tell you it has to be manipulated, and that's how the Bretton Woods worked. It was $35 an ounce. From 1944 to 1971, the price of gold was $35 an ounce. Well, during that time period, you weren't allowed to own gold, but there would have been no point in owning gold because it would have been $35 an ounce. So you'd have been better off owning something else. So I don't like it from the point of view. I like the fact that it restrains the governments and the central banks and the politicians from printing money or spending money that they don't have. But if they shut the exit door and they've locked up the gold, you're no better off, really. Now the problem is they're restrained from even trying to grow the economy, and you have no place to put your savings. Now you can say, well, you put your savings in the currency and it's backed by gold. Remember, under the Bretton Woods Agreement, it wasn't. Before it was. In 1933, you could save in gold. You go to the bank, they give you gold coins, you can bring them home, you have them, now you're saving in gold. Or you can leave cash in the bank and then you can always turn it in with a gold certificate. But under the Bretton Woods Agreement, you as a person could not turn in your fiat currency for gold. Only central banks could turn it in for gold. So if that's the type of gold standard, going back on the Bretton Woods Agreement would not be a good thing. It would basically mean all the gold would be in the hands of the central banks and you wouldn't have access to it. So you'd have to rely on what they're doing, just like you have to rely on what they're doing now. Now, the only advantage that you'd say, well, they couldn't do as much. Well, maybe. That might be the situation. All right, I think that's all the points I want to make on the gold standard. I don't think it's a good idea, but for different reasons. And also, you have to realize central banks, and Neil Kashkari's point was very salient, is he was saying the money supply wouldn't move one way or the other very much. You'd be at the mercy, he didn't say it this way, but this is what he meant. You'd be at the mercy of the gold miners to increase the money supply. So you couldn't do quantitative easing, and you couldn't do quantitative tightenings. Now, some would argue that's more free market, but one of the problems with the Bretton Woods Agreement was they used to follow what happened in South Africa. Why South Africa? Why should South Africa matter one stitch to what's happening in the rest of the world in 1965, 1968? Well, because it was the goal, it was the money supply to a certain extent to the Western world. The other big source of gold mining was Russia, and that was part of the Soviet Union. So that didn't enter into the Western Bretton Woods agreements. So they relied on whatever came out of South Africa. And there were times towards the end, it's interesting, you could see the United States was probably putting tremendous pressure on South Africa to overproduce. It produced an amazing amount of gold a few years in the late 60s, early 70s. That's because the United States was losing a lot of gold because the United States was now running a deficit, and foreign central banks were coming back to the United States and trying to chain their dollars in for gold, and the U.S. was losing their dollars. So the gold standard actually probably hurt South Africa. I mean, the United States certainly probably looked the other way on their apartheid policy because they were the source of gold. So Kashkari's point is you're at the mercy for the money supply based on the gold. And in today's world, the number one and number two gold producers, he didn't mention this, he didn't mention anything, he just had the one short tweet. The number one and number two gold producers are China and Russia, and that gold stays within Russia and or China. China keeps all of its gold and imports some. Russia keeps most of its gold and then exports some to China, and now is going to also export some to India. So it wouldn't make sense. It'd be very hard to pull off. Now, it also doesn't make a stitch of sense for China to do a gold standard on its own. This gold-backed yuan is coming game changer. China would be gone. China's gold would be gone in no time, even though they have a budget surplus. There would be other occasions, especially in the oil, where if people were getting yuan as part of the yuan-denominated oils contract, and they wanted to turn those yuan in for gold, they would get drained of a lot of their gold, and it wouldn't make any sense for China to do that. They certainly wouldn't want to back the yuan and make it redeemable in general, and China has zero interest in restraining its spending. China, more than any country on earth, relies on credit creation and money printing because it must generate 6, 7, 8% GDP every year. And the way they do that is they bring demand forward by stimulus, by printing, and they also build stuff that they don't need because they have to keep the economy going. They've got 300, 400 million people that have moved in from the cities, from the country into the cities that they have to keep working, and they have to do make work, they will. And how do they do that? Well, normally in a free market economy, entrepreneurs would never borrow money to build something unless they had a reasonable expectation of profit. China doesn't care. The Central Bank of China, the People's Bank of China, tells the state-owned banks to loan money to state-owned enterprises if the state-owned enterprises want to build something that'll put people to work, even though they may not need it or it may not be economical to build it. So the last thing China needs is to say, no, we can't issue credit unless we've got the equivalent amount of gold. That's never, ever, ever going to happen. China has to continue at a pace of credit creation. So that's it for the gold standard, and no other country is going to do it. It wouldn't make any sense for any country to do it, and it's just not going to happen. Let's take a look now at the some of the questions and comments that we've got. All right. Well, Gustav Broken is up late at night in the Netherlands, and he's listening to Jump, Van Halen. All right. Gusta broken. We can all talk about markets ad infinitum. We all know we're getting screwed. Well, that's right. I'm not trying to change anything. I'm just analyzing what's going on. That's right. Just conversation. Actually, it's all useless info. It keeps us amused. Yep. A very nihilistic point of view there, Gus, but I know it's late in the Netherlands. Miser, will be very interesting to see where gold and silver close on the weekly this Friday. Yes, indeed. Rod Panhard, gold standard, kept government honest. To a point, that is definitely true. Let's see. Gusta broken. I can hardly take all this market manipulation seriously. Yep. DW, everything is price manipulated. Okay. Pad. These Masonic freaks that have ruled the world for thousands of years would rather destroy us all over returning to the gold standard. Yeah, there's no reason they would fight that tooth and nail. And here's the thing. I love when the gold commentators say the people would demand the confidence of gold. People don't know jack about gold to demand it. Why would they? They didn't demand it in 2008. In fact, what people demanded was free money. Bush sending out checks to people. China went into overdrive in the credit creation to take the world out of the recession, the global recession, the global depression. People don't think. In fact, if the first thing people thought of, which they don't, there's just not a gold consciousness. It's been driven out. There's very few people alive today that have even transacted in silver species, silver coins. And there's probably no one really there's probably a few people in their 80s or 90s that might have actually transacted in gold. So the gold standard from 1944 to 1971, Bretton Woods, wasn't a gold standard for the people. It was only a gold standard for the banks. So that's a totally different thing, and people don't think in terms of gold. Now, I do know, I remember in the early 70s, the Europeans were always hoping in 1972, 1973, 1974, maybe we can get back on this gold standard. Maybe we can get Nixon to, and then Nixon pulled off the petrodollar agreements. And ever since then, we've had generations of people and bankers that have no exposure, even thinking about gold, stability of gold, and so on. Pat, the CME with the London Bullion Bank could take gold next to nothing tomorrow if they wanted to a certain extent. What they couldn't do is what I talked about the other night, is there is a demand for gold jewelry and silver jewelry. So there would always be that physical demand. Thankfully, this is one of my points, is that investment demand for gold is only 27%, and it's even lower for silver, although there's some central bank demand for gold. Gusta broken. You can talk about the economy ad infinitum. ECB and IMF control the economy. How are you going to break free? Not here to offer solutions at this moment. All right. Pat, a gold standard is the ultimate price rating. That's right. Now, that is exactly what it is, but it's for your own benefit. See, the paternalistic government holds the gold, and because it's the one that creates the money, it's the one who gets to hold the gold. Well, they have problems with that. Rod Panhard, perhaps the plan is to go to a crypto gold standard, spin the narrative about digital gold, but have crypto forks as QE instead of forking a separate entity, just double the money supply. That's quite possible. I think central banks like cryptos because of the ability to track and trace them. One of the problems we have today with gold is we really don't know how much gold there is. And you can always find gold. There can always be a new source of gold. During the period of time in the 15th, 16th, 17th century when the Europeans were looking at the New World and making massive discoveries of gold and silver and bringing them back to their countries, they created massive inflation. The thing about cryptos, if everyone is on a set crypto and maybe they give it some leeway so they can increase the money supply when they want, they would love that because they would know exactly what they're doing. Problem with dollars right now is 2/3 of, I think there's only about 3 trillion physical dollars in existence, and there's only like 1 trillion in the country, and there's like 25 trillion. I don't know if the number is some ridiculous number. There's not even enough unbacked physical dollars for you to go to the bank and get them. Forget the fractional reserve banking part. There just are not enough physical dollars, and no one seems to care. People use their credit cards. They They write checks. They don't have to have the cash. Makes it even worse. 2/3 of the cash is overseas. But the problem with that is there's counterfeiters, and people have suggested or hypothesized or accused Iran and North Korea of actually printing up even more money. So the beauty of cryptos for a central bank is they can fix the money supply, or they can fix it on a sliding scale, and then you would know exactly where every single dollar went. Now, they might not like that from the point of view that they couldn't do these side deals and different types of QE, but they can have two blockchains. One where they can give it out to whoever they want, you would never know it, and the other would be the public blockchain where they would track you and every dollar that you spent and every dollar that they spent and the government spent. Gus the Broken! He's putting the pressure on. We know the problems now. Answers, please. It's not the point of this point of this channel is to do analysis and to get you to think, not to provide recommendations. It's not to tell you gold is set to skyrocket. It's really here just to do analysis, and perhaps someone, or maybe me or somebody, will come up with a solution, but the goal is not solution-based or investment-based. Tom Manley is here. Good evening. Gus the Broken, you were right. There is no possibility of bankers breaking free from these debt slavers. Rod Gibbs, you think they manipulate it now? Well, that's what would happen on a gold standard. Gus the Broken really riding me. Answers one bullet man, one man. There you go. Matthew Rhodes. Since 1965, gold has outpaced the New York Composite 24 times for stocks, 34 times for gold. In real terms, there has been negative U.S. growth in terms of gold. That is pure price and pricing for over 50 years. Tom Manley. Only way to make the bankers suffer is stay out of debt as much as possible. Well, there you go. So if you think about the monies that the bankers made, but even that, they still would not be, they would forego that revenue. And that's a portion of what they make. The amount of money that they make trading, though, dwarfs everything. They make more money trading than they do actual real banking, which is bringing financing to companies so that they can go public. Basically, the trading operations, the amount of trades that they make just in like 10 seconds is just incredible. And they always win. And that's why they're always looking for, that's why they love derivatives, because you don't have to keep creating new products. You just have the same products and you create more derivatives off those products, and then you trade those and you make a fortune off them. Pat, for gold being confiscated in 1933, there sure were a lot of pre-1933 gold coins for sales. Yeah, that means not many turn into gold, I bet. That is definitely true, and from reading interviews with people, they say that it was more voluntary, that no one really got prosecuted, and a lot of people didn't turn into gold. Although there was one story of somebody, and I think they found pre-1933 gold, and when they went to turn it in, they basically said they weren't allowed to have it. There's a lot of legal issues with, I think you can buy pre-1933 gold. I don't think you have any issues with it today. I guess it's no longer illegal to own, but I think if somehow they can trace it back to, there was some coin dealer who didn't turn it in, and he held on to something that was rare, or there was another case where they had found pre-1933 gold, they will get a bit aggressive and say, well, that was gold that should have been turned in. I don't know how there's an exemption, though. Like, I think you can go on APMEX or whatever, and you can buy pre-1933 gold. So anyone knows what the legal reason there is why that's okay, because technically those coins should have been turned in under the Executive Order 6102. I should know the answer to that, but I don't. Pat, Tom Manley, you're right. Money's worthless and lent and earns interest. Database DNA. We should be smart enough not to allow them to fix the price of gold. Well, that's what I say. And I don't think anyone's going to demand in any type of situation that anyone goes on the gold standard. And as Pat noted earlier, there's no way they're going to allow it. They don't want that. They don't want to be controlled that way. And the people don't know enough to demand for them to be controlled that way. Yes, when Nixon took us off, it's because de Gaulle and Germany and Switzerland were keeping the U.S. honest by redeeming their fiat for gold with no set price. And the problem there was they were starting to get a lot of dollars because they were starting to run trade surpluses, not just with the U.S., but with each other and other countries. And they figured, okay, the gold or the dollar? What should I have? Well, I think I'm going to have the gold. I mean, why wouldn't you? The only reason you wouldn't is because you had to take a war. At the time, you had to come over with the warship and collect it from the treasury. What a lot of them did was, I guess, they just left it at the New York Fed, as we can see. That probably wasn't too good of an idea. Gold was money pre-1933. Today still is. It's the people don't know the difference. That's a little philosophical. Money has to have a currency element, a medium of exchange. You can't use gold coins today. You can at the face value, but gold is not used as a currency, so it doesn't meet the current test for money. It meets the overall test. It used to be money for sure, the best money there was, but today it's not. We'll all go down the drain unless we can reverse this insanity. Database DNA, gold standard would end fiat finance wars. That's true. You think about when the classical gold standard ended was 1914. And what happened? You had World War I. What happened in 1913? You had the Fed. You had the income tax. So once governments have the ability to have unrestrained fiat creation, they can go into wars. Also, interesting point for you. Democracies. Everyone thinks democracies are great, are more likely to go into war than feudal kingdoms. Why? Because the person in power in a democracy can actually get people riled up to go to war. And also, it's not his money and not his kingdom that's going to get destroyed if the war goes wrong. In a kingdom, the guy or the queen, they want to preserve it for their kids and their progeny and so on. So you're less likely to have a war, and it's going to cost the guy money, and he's going to have to go and tax his people. That's going to get him pissed off. But so if you think about World War II, you had big democracies. You had the Nazis were a democracy. They voted Hitler in. You had Roosevelt. You had Hitler, and then Stalin was also, in a sense, a populist movement. You had the Russian Revolution. And think about it. Those countries all went to war. So did Napoleon. The kings and the queens are less likely to go to war. And they have to find alternative means of financing. But democracies, if they have the power to tax and print, they can finance the wars. Good point, Database DNA. Database DNA, yes, Nixon defaulted on the gold. That was the fifth bankruptcy of America. Matthew Rhodes, as long as people can eat their Big Macs, drive the Ford trucks, and watch American Idol, they don't care about anything. That's true about consumers across the world. That's true right now in China. Their extra wealth that they have. People in India. People are the same anywhere. I like people think that only Americans are consumerists. The only people that aren't consumerists, I would say, are Muslims. They tend to stay away from that stuff on religious grounds. Pat, I offered to teach my neighbor how to read charts to help him understand when he's invested in his 401k, but he says he's not interested. Yeah, and he's the guy that's going to be clamoring for a gold standard? I don't think so. Database, you could have a gold trade note to settle international trade. Yeah, there's a point I didn't make. Let me cover that now. That is the only thing that makes sense, is the gold trade note. So let's say China. They're not going to back their yuan. They're not going to make it exchangeable. They'd lose their gold. It makes no sense. What does make sense is, let's say, here's where de-dollarization comes in. Let's say China and Iran don't want to use the dollar. Okay, fine. There's many reasons they don't want to do that. But China doesn't want to take Iranian, whatever their currency is. And Iran really doesn't want the yuan because, as we see, it can get devalued. They don't trust it. They don't want it. Well, they would do a gold trade note. And it wouldn't be gold. It would be transaction by transaction. It wouldn't be the currency was back. It would mean the transaction was back. So if Iran wanted to sell oil to China, then China might pay in gold. However, Iran would probably want a lot of refrigerators and a lot of goods that China makes. China's not going to take the Iranian currency. They'd ask Iran to give them a note backed by gold, and that transaction would be backed by gold. The good news for China would be, if they continue to run a trade surplus, that would be one way they would increase the amount of gold that they have. Because as they didn't use their own currency, or they didn't use the currency of the trading partner, and they didn't use the dollar by default, and they used a gold note, that makes total sense. I don't know. That must be going on. It certainly is going on. That's an easy way to evade sanctions, and it's a lot better than taking the risk that you're going to take a third world currency as payment. Really buying your stuff from another country and not matching your own country is still suicide. I agree with that. The Amish don't worry about any of this. They make you everything made locally. That's right. If you can churn your own butter, and you can generate your own power, you're not going to get the dynamic economy, but you are going to be the self-sufficient economy. You're not going to have issues of worrying about supply chains, worrying about... The problem with today's world is you are dependent on so much of somebody else, of counterparties, of someone to bring you your oil, someone to deliver your electricity, whatever it is, fix your car, make your food, shovel your snow. I mean, there's just so many things that people don't do themselves, and that's an issue. And money is another one. If they take money out of your hands and they control that, it just can be stolen from you without you even noticing it. Gusta broken. Matthew Rhodes, that is what is to change that. Until that dies, it's business as usual. Matthew Rhodes, I was the same way until 2008. People won't change until the next disaster that disrupts their lives. No, that's definitely true. Disasters, wars definitely have a changing impact on people. Yep. Well, the way you help, I mean, even the problem with trying to help people by telling them something, I think as someone said earlier, it's in one ear and out the other. I think Pat was saying you're trying to help someone with the 401k. People will ask you after when it's too late. Like, oh, what were you telling me about about prepping or whatever it is? They'll ask you after. Only way to beat the bankers is to make them honest. Yeah, well, that's never been the case. So, Matthew Rhodes, appreciated efforts. By the way, Fender Rhodes, great. Fender Rhodes, isn't that the keyboard? When the Deutsche Bank goes down, what is going to happen to the price of precious metals? Not that I believe what you say. I don't know. Depends on if Deutsche Bank goes down. It depends on what the reaction of the German Bundesbank is, or what the reaction of the ECB is. It depends on what the open exposure is on Deutsche Bank's derivatives. Everyone talks about, oh, they got trillions of derivatives. If you know anything about derivatives, and I did some work with them for a number of years, there's a winner and loser on each side. You don't know that the derivative book that Deutsche Bank has all losers in it. It may have a lot of winners in it. In fact, it may be on balance positive. So the fact that there's whatever notional amount of derivatives doesn't mean that they all go down and it takes the system down. What it does mean is, you see, if Deutsche Bank were to go down, the concern then is Deutsche Bank wouldn't be able to pay on the derivatives that it's at a loss. But remember, it can also collect on the derivatives that it's positive on. So what I think about Deutsche Bank is, I don't think anyone knows what would happen if a major bank went down. You don't know what the knock-on effect is. There's no way of knowing. The problem with derivatives, they're not regulated, they're not registered. I used to draft them. They can be issued. They're pursuant to the currency interest rate swap agreement, is the agreement that you don't know how many are out there, and you don't know who's exposed to what, and you don't know who all the counterparties is. So no one knows, and I can't say that I know, but people are convinced they know, and that whatever event is going to happen, it's always positive for gold and silver. That's always annoyed me, that somehow, for example, the other day somebody was saying, we don't know how much gold is in the COMEX. Oh, okay, you don't. But for all we know, it could be, it's eligible, will never be registered. Okay. So what does that mean? It could also, for all you know, all be eligible eventually, and not. The idea that when people focus on one area because they heard somebody talk about it, convinced that this is the trigger, and this is the event, then it's game over. You don't know that. And especially they don't have the numbers on it, so how could they even convince you? Well, they can convince you because you believe it, you want to believe, and you always want to believe gold and silver are set to skyrocket. And that makes you susceptible to listening to a lot of nonsense. Single cell organism. Precious metals are no price other than the banking system wants them priced at. Unfortunately, that's probably 70 to 80% true. And when the banks aren't there, who cares about metal? Well, see, I was talking to Silver Fortune tonight, Matthew, and the funny thing is, we got to the point where we're talking about, while hard assets are better, but hard assets are priced in fiat assets. So, you all want to get rich on gold and silver, but what does rich mean? You want to then eventually cash it in for fiat so you can spend it. So they're almost chicken egg there. Pat, okay, I'm convinced. Let's address Trump as king to stop the endless wars he came over. No, appointing a king is different. I guess you'd have to appoint him and say he owns the United States. Not sure that's a good idea either. But then you really would not have a war. You'd be much more frugal. Remember the old Milton Friedman thing? We broke money into four. He basically said you spend your own money on yourself is where you pay the most attention. The second thing is you spend your own money on somebody else. Like you're buying a gift, you don't pay as much attention, but you still want to get good value. Then, he says, when you spend somebody else's money on yourself, like you're on an expense account, you're not as concerned about getting the best price, but you want to make sure you get the right stuff because you're going to eat it, if you're not at a restaurant. You might buy something at a restaurant on an expense account that you wouldn't have paid for yourself, stuff like that. But the worst is when you spend somebody else's money on somebody else. And that's like, you're in charge of administering the school budget. You're not sure. You don't really care as much whether you get the right value for what you're doing. So, all right, gold is the enemy of the global banking system. 33, 2017, 213, smashed. Can't win with them other than shorting or use for hedge during that brief moment of economic turbulence. Matthew R. Keeps sounding off even if you don't have the gear. Oh, that means. Pat, single cell organism. You're right. Gold allows for wealth preservation. Governments want you dependent on them, not self-sufficient where you don't need the government. That's true. Now think about what a king wants. A king doesn't want you dependent on him. Why? He doesn't want to have to pay for you. In fact, what the king wants is you to be loyal to him and actually work for him. He doesn't want to give you anything. I guess that's a big difference. The king expects that's why you're the serf. You're supposed to work for him. In government, they want to give you stuff. The stuff that's not yours, not theirs. Stuff they can only take from somebody else. All right. Tom Manley. They're all interconnected. One falls, they all fall. Well, I guess that's true with Deutsche Bank. Yeah. Deutsche Bank is going down now, didn't they? They laid off 10% of their workforce. They've got a lot of problems. Stock price is really low. It's just, I don't think even if I had the financial seats in front of them, I'd be able to make heads or tails of it. Anyway, single cell organism, I agree, but we need limited government. That's not what we have. We have unlimited government, not good. And the trend is towards that only because that's just the natural way governments work. Follow the money. Who has to pay the margin calls if the system goes south? Well, here's one tricky guy. If I have a margin call and I have to pay money, but I have to pay it to somebody who also has margin calls, and therefore they're out of business, and maybe I don't have to pay him. Now, I know there's bankruptcy, and you have to pay into the bankruptcy trustee, but there could be situations where everyone owes. Well, that's the way it is right now. If you think about the amount of debt that's outstanding globally, it's far in excess of just the amount of goods and services that are currently being produced. So there's definitely a shortage somewhere. ECB and IMF is in dire straits. I don't know if the IMF is in dire straits. The IMF isn't anything. It's just there on its own and has the members. The ECB could be in trouble. Game changer, game over, bing bang boom, says Pad. Awake one. Looks like Deutsche Bank is hitting all-time low today's. Yep. Yeah, they're on vacation. Deutsche Bank. Let's see anything else. Okay, that's about it for the comments here. Flight 19 says Douche Bank is going to take the world to the cleaners with a chain reaction. That'll make 2009 look like a piker. Could be. Again, I mean, that's something that if I had a bet, probably couldn't be contained very early. But here's something you got to remember about derivatives. The people who own them were constantly repricing them, constantly readjusting them. It's not like there's a set book of derivatives and Deutsche Bank owes or people are owed. You would have to imagine that counterparties with Deutsche Bank are well aware of their circumstances, and they have readjusted and rehedged their derivatives. So it may not be as dire as people might think, or it may be worse than people think. Again, no one knows, and anyone who tells you they know, they're just making it up. That's something I try not to do here. All right, well, thank you very much for joining me tonight. Make sure you join me every night at 8 o'clock. Haven't picked a topic for tomorrow night. I'm sure I'll come up with something. But if you have any topics you'd like discussed, let me know. Shoot me an email or put a comment below. Thank you very much for joining me.